It's especially significant this year because 2 weeks before the festival, Roger Ebert passed away. Quite well. I mean, I guess we can't say quite suddenly. He put out an article that said, "My health is not as great as it should be. I'm going to resign from my position at the Sun-Times, and I'm going to focus on my online stuff, and I'm going to do all this other stuff." And we all thought, "Great. Good job hanging in there, Roger." And then it was literally like the same week, later that week.
It was about 2 days later.
It was announced that he'd passed away. So, he had a very well-publicized battle with cancer. He lost his jaw because of it. He couldn't speak. And I don't know if it was that same cancer or a different cancer that came back. And it was, the battle with that he finally lost. But we should definitely spend some time just talking about Roger because we haven't had a chance to do that yet. We've been doing other episodes. And Craig, I think you should maybe jump in there and start.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, it's funny, when people say, did you know Roger? The answer can be yes and no at the same time. I mean, I met him once in person. That was actually at Ebertfest 2 years ago when and actually John gave me the justification for that because he knew I was going and he asked me if I could give Roger an IU Cinema hat. So I ran into him in the lobby and I gave him the hat and I kind of babbled something semi-intelligible. And he was wonderful. I mean, he put the hat on his heart.
Yeah.
And he gave me the firmest handshake I swear I have ever had in my life. He was so that was a wonderful experience. But I mean, before that, I first became acquainted with him like everyone else with the TV show, Siskel and Ebert. Anyone who says Siskel and Ebert killed film criticism doesn't know what the heck they're talking about because the great thing about that show, as another friend of mine said, it was kind of a Trojan horse way of slipping in, again, overlooked films. My Dinner with Andre has been talked about a lot. Who living anywhere outside of New York, LA, Chicago would have ever heard of films like My Dinner with Andre, One False Move, a lot of really good films that they went out of their way to champion, and they took on the MPAA ratings and colorization with Ted Turner and all kinds of things like that. So, and then I became, of course, acquainted with his writing. I didn't even know he was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer until years after that. And then I actually became acquainted with him indirectly in the mid-'90s on CompuServe.
Okay.
Roger was a pioneer in online criticism, just like he was a pioneer in TV criticism and newspaper syndication. And he had this CompuServe forum in like 1994 or 95, and I popped on there. And those are the days where you couldn't validate accounts. So people would say, is this really Roger Ebert? And he would say, yes, no, would any answer satisfy you? But eventually it just became clear that it was him. And I always mention that because a lot of people draw links. If you read a lot of the obituaries a couple weeks ago, they drew links between him losing his voice 5 or 6 years ago with him going online and taking over Twitter with 800,000 followers. And all of that's true, but it's important to remember that he was a visionary long before that. I mean, he saw the possibilities long before everyone else.
I remember reading an article from him in like 83 or something ridiculous like that where he was like, yeah, in 20 years you'll be able to just dial up whatever movie you want on your television. And it was like he just had a sense of that sort of thing. Like he could see into the future that way that I think a lot of people just couldn't see things as clearly as he could.
Yeah, he was amazing. I'd say after my parents, probably nobody influenced me more in terms of my love of film and writing and just all kinds of things. And I think everybody feels that his writing, as good as it always was, the last few years after he lost his voice, his ability to speak, that's when he really reached a pinnacle of creativity and honesty where he would somebody wrote it, he began to retreat further into his rich and sophisticated mind, and he would talk about himself in a very personal way. And he wrote an article in 2011 called Why I Do Not Fear Death. And it wasn't, as other people have pointed out, it wasn't like a nihilistic thing where he said he didn't believe in God and so forth. It was just kind of a very matter-of-fact and upbeat and in a way joyful outlook that he shared.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I I never thought of Roger Ebert as like the end-all be-all of film critics, but every time I wanted to look up a review of a film, I would go see what he had to say first. You know, it was just second nature. I don't think it's possible with the internet for anyone to achieve that ever again. I don't see how one person could become the nation's, the world's film critic anymore. There's just too many people doing it. It's too easy to do it. Look at us. We just started. I was just like, Jason, you want to do a podcast? He was like, yeah. I asked John, is it okay if we do a podcast? Sure. We were doing it in like 2 months. It was done. You know, and I think the thing that, you know, what I love most is that his reviews were always to the point. He didn't write 2,000-word reviews that would take you, you know, a couple sessions to read through. They were tight. You know, they're always tight, you know, 10 paragraphs usually for these films. And the other thing that I think I really love is that he was very inclusive.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even if, you know, I would read his reviews on like schlocky horror movies and I would think, and he would hate them. And I would think, why is he reviewing this movie? Like, he knew he wasn't going to like it. He knew he wasn't going to care about this movie. It's below him, but it wasn't. Nothing was below him. He would review anything. And I think that's something that I would like to keep in mind as we're doing this. It's like all the movies are worth your time. You know, you just look at it. Look at it and see what you can find in it. And even if at the end of the process you think it's terrible, at least then you can say, I watched this movie, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a way of maintaining your sort of validation. You know, it's like you always get that like, oh, well, you've never seen it. And it's like everyone knows something's bad before they actually watch it. You know, you can have a good idea, and then sometimes you're pleasantly surprised. But that's the other thing about Roger that I really liked was a lot of times he would go watch these like just supposedly awful movies, and then he'd like love them. You're like, how everyone likes a bad movie every now and then, and it just made him really seem more human, very just relatable in that way. And there are a lot of movies that come to mind when I think about that, and that really helped me sort of relate to him a lot more than I ever thought I would, because of course I grew up watching him on TV. What was really interesting about Roger, of course, we talk about sort of when he lost his voice. I thought it was even more interesting when he lost Siskel. Sort of his struggle, because I really feel like that was the actual time when he sort of really started to become his own critic. Like,
good point, yeah.
He just really, you could tell, like he was just really struggling. Like, do I keep doing the show? He was bringing other people in. Of course, he did it with Roper for a number of years. And that relationship, was still maintained up until the day he died. But it was just really, it together they were something, but separate they were even more. I thought, if that's makes sense to anybody the way I put it. But it was just really interesting. And then of course, he lost his voice. And if you've never read the Esquire article about him and that whole situation, you're missing out. Like, that was a beautiful piece of just a story. It's just a story that everybody needs to know, because it's like everyone's like, oh yeah, he lost his voice. No, he didn't. And you put that really well earlier, Craig. And that's the one thing. That was when I think my real true love and hate relationship with Roger Ebert began, because I did follow him on Twitter, and then he just became too much on Twitter. Like, it was just like, does he sleep? It's like, okay, he's just on all the time. He's tweeting constantly. And so I would unfollow him, and then I'd be like, I wonder what Roger's doing. So I'd click on the follow button, and then here comes just the waves of just things that weren't necessarily reviews. They were just like random things that I would tweet out, and I'd be like, oh, I'm really kind of getting burnt out on this Roger guy. Unfollow, it's like, I'm sure he probably, I'd be really, like, in my own, like, little world, I want to think that he was just sitting there and was like, who's this Jason guy who keeps following and unfollowing me? He's like, I'm glad he didn't block me, because he probably thought I was some sort of, like, spam bot or something. But that was what, was really interesting about the guy was that he was larger than life, but he just seemed so human at the same time, just sort of just an everyday person. And I really liked what you said, Andy, about sort of there not being somebody else like him, because you're right. Anybody can be a movie critic. And there are other critics that I would go to. Like there's a couple guys that I follow that I really trust because my sort of line of thinking follows theirs. But Roger always had something special to say, just a little bit more than everyone else. So he definitely will be missed, and was probably the first critic I knew by name, like a movie critic. It wasn't just like opening the newspaper and being like some random like local columnist. It was like, oh yeah, Roger Ebert. He's the movie critic.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I didn't get to go to Ebertfest this year, and I was really curious to know how that was going to play out at the actual festival. So it always just seems like Ebertfest doesn't work with my social schedule.
Yeah.
I had a family matter last year, and then this year I had a work commitment. So I'm kind of jealous that you guys got to go, but definitely it's just moved by sort of his work, and it was a shock because it just seemed to come out of nowhere. Because I was like, okay, did I read that wrong? Like I thought he was just sick. Like it just seemed so sudden.
Yeah, well, and it felt like he wrote that article, and then it happened so soon after that you're like, this is some kind of prank. Like somebody is, and then the Sun-Times tweeted it, and you're like, oh,
yeah. And then his wife basically confirmed it. And so what's really interesting is that a lot of people are like, well, his voice will never be heard again. And it's like, I don't know. His wife does a pretty good job at sort of summing up his life, especially towards the end there. She had that really nice piece about sort of his last day. And again, if you haven't sort of read that, I think it was published, right?
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. So I recommend checking that out. But definitely check out the Esquire article. Just type in Esquire, Roger Ebert. You'll see it. And it's a pretty lengthy piece, but definitely worth checking out because it really just sort of paints this picture of who he became after his battle and stuff. So
yeah. Well, A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.